Okay, so we were saying that the profit margin should be compared to the industry average profit margin, right? For tax, audit, and business advisory, right? Which is not given, right? This should be compared with the industry average, this should be compared with the industry average, and this should be compared with the industry average. But this comparison is not given to us. Right? So if you are just not given the comparatives of the industry, it means that what APX accountancy currently is doing, they are actually comparing the profit margins with each other, which is not a very good thing to do, right? Because they are different. So they should not be compared with each other, right? So that was about equity, right? Can you see in the standard, we have something on equity, right? And we said that, well, it is not actually fair, right? The performance targets are not actually fair for all the different partners, but the ownership and achievability are not even considered in this scenario at all. Nothing has been asked from each of the manager, and we have not considered if the targets are achievable or not. So we'll simply say that these two are ignored. So ownership, we'll say this is ignored. And then achievability, this is also ignored. Totally ignored. That's the weakness of the system, isn't it? Now, the third dimension, the third building block was the reward system, which has clarity, motivation, and controllability, right? So let's give a main headline, rewards. I'm going to put it in the box actually, all the main headlines, the standard and dimensions. So increase the visibility. Okay, rewards. In rewards, the first one was clarity. The qualities of the rewards, first one was clarity. So 2 points we actually identified. First one, point number 1, up to 10%. This means it's not very clear, right? Not very clear. The reward system should be very clear. How do you achieve the reward? Again, the second point that we identified, we said it depends on the line manager's review. Again, not very clear. Right? It's not very clear. Now, what about the second point in rewards? It was the motivation, right? In the motivation, we identified that, well, it's on the basis of contractual responsibility. We said rather than on the basis of contractual responsibility, it should be on the basis of actual performance, real performance contributed towards the profitability. So motivation, right? Like, let's say if you have a contract with someone to do something, right? You have done it and you get your reward, right? It won't be that motivating, right? Because the something that you're doing actually for the business may not be in your control also, right? But it does not show you the real performance, right? So we will say that motivation, we'll say the rewards are based on contractual responsibility, not on the basis of real performance, contributed towards profitability, right? It does not show you the real performance towards profitability. Okay, what about the next one? The next one was controllable, controllability factor, right? And in this, of course, we can talk about that the tax and the audit partners have no control over the recession, right? So if they're not performing well because of the recession, it's not in their control, right? And that's why if you actually compare it with the industry average, then you can actually get some kind of comparison, right? Or some kind of sense. But if you don't consider the industry average, then of course, that will not be actually very clever, because that's not considering the controllability at all. So controllability, right? So we can say tax and audit partner have no control over recession, right? And then we can say profit margin. Okay, I'm doing something deliberately wrong, but I'll tell you why, right? Even if you write it, it doesn't matter, right? It will be considered to be correct, but maybe you should not be writing this point. But let's say, let's write it. Profit margin, which will be a percentage, profit margin percentage need to be compared with industry average. Industry average profit margins, which are missing, which are not given, right? Now, why did I say actually that we should not be actually saying this? We'll discuss it in a minute. But you can see, that's the performance management system. So we are assessing the performance. If the performance management, sorry, we are assessing the system of the performance. And we're considering three building blocks: dimensions, and we said financial performance is considered, comparative performance is considered, quality is also considered up to some extent. Is it good measure or bad measure? That is something else, but at least we have some measures. We don't have any measures for these three. Then in standard, we have equity, but it's not actually fair. It's not considered, the fairness is not considered. Ownership and achievability, nothing has been mentioned in the question, right? Rewards, we can talk about the clarity. We can say that because of these 2 points, they are not very clear. From the motivation perspective, we can say that it is based on the contractual responsibility rather than the real performance. And the controllability factor can be seen or it can be seen in, again, in the recession time period, which is not in the control of some of the managers or some of the partners, right? So this is a building block model, and we have assessed the performance, right? Now, of course, I have actually said a lot of things, and for 8-marker question, you are not going to say so much, right? But what I have told you, even if you remember like 70% of this, you're going to pass this question, which means that you'll get 50% marks in these 8 marks, right? And then you have explain the main improvements the introduction of the building block model to the performance management could provide, and suggest specific improvements to the existing system of performance measure at APX in the light of the introduction of building block model. Okay. Now, whenever you see and in the question, remember that this 8-mark question need to be subdivided into 2 parts, right? This one question actually contains 2 questions, right? So we have to break it down. The first requirement was explain the main improvement of the introduction of building block model approach, right, could provide. So what will happen if you apply building block model approach, right? That is the first half of the question. Well, we can simply say the things that we have identified in here, that, well, this is ignored, clarity is not considered, motivation is not considered, right? All these things that are ignored, if you will be following the building block model, you will be actually considering all of them, right? And then the second part of the question says, suggest specific improvements, right? Don't talk about general things, specific improvements to the existing system of performance measures, right? So what will be improved if you will have the building block model approach, right? So the weaknesses that we have identified in the second point, the second part, part B, we can actually give some suggestions now. A very common problem in exam is that when students are not asked about the suggestions, students are going to start giving suggestions, right? So sometimes during your exam, you'll feel very confident and then you'll start giving suggestions, and the examiner may not have asked for any suggestions. So please don't suggest anything if it is not asked, right? And if it is asked over here now, so you should be suggesting. So the point that I was saying that, well, maybe I should not have mentioned the last point, that the profit margin need to be compared with the industry average. Well, I'm suggesting something, isn't it? So I should not have suggested when in part B, the suggestion was not required. But then I covered it. We said that they should be done, but this is missing. So I was actually trying to identify the weakness. So I suggested in such a way that it is identifying the weakness, right? And we were considering the weaknesses. If you don't want to give this suggestion over here, maybe then you can give this same suggestion in the next question, the next answer. Now, in part C, First of all, improvement provided by building block model, right? That was the first requirement. Explain main improvements. So what we're missing in here, right? We are going to identify all of them, right? So I'll try to use the same words given to us in the question. So I'll say, and this will actually create an impression in the marker's mind that, well, you are actually answering the question. So you try to get the words from the question, right? So improvement provided by building block model. So that your marker can see that, well, this looks like to be the first half of part C question, right? Now, of course, I have to explain it, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. You see, it's 8-marker question, and in 8-marker question, you actually have 2 questions. So you should not be going into too much detail in the first half of part C question, right? So I will say, I'll actually write it in a paragraph, but then I'm going to just identify the things that were missing. And building block model is not going to ignore it. So what was missing? Innovation was missing in the dimensions. Innovation was missing in dimension. Flexibility. That was missing in the dimensions. Resource utilization. That was also missing in the current performance measure, right, in the dimensions. Then in the standards, what was missing in the standard? Ownership, right? In the standard, what was missing? Ownership and achievability. Achievability, that was missing in the standards. In the rewards, what was totally ignored? Controllability. Well, these were the points that were missing, right? So of course, I should not be writing it like this. I should be writing it in a paragraph, right? But we can actually mention that they were totally ignored, right? And they will be considered in the building block model. So they are currently ignored, but will be considered if building block model is followed. If you actually write it in a paragraph, this will give you the first 3 to 4 marks. I'll say 3 marks maybe for this half of the question, and the second half of the question will require a bit more, and then you can give the suggestions, right? That was the first half of part C. The second half of part C will be on suggestions. So I would say suggestion on performance measures. Right? Can you give me some suggestion, guys? What do you think? What will you be suggesting, right? If these things, if these points were ignored, right? Well, of course, you cannot actually give suggestion for all of them, just because you're not actually given too many marks, right? Can you actually give a suggestion, let's say, for innovation? Can you give a measure for innovation to APX accountancy? Can you give one suggestion for innovation? Anyone? So let's say, for example, innovation. From innovation's perspective, are we actually performing good from innovation's perspective, which is totally ignored before? Now, if in the building block model is used, we will be considering the innovation perspective, innovation dimension, right? Innovation when we are actually introducing new things, right? So let's say if you have introduced a new service, how is the new service performing in comparison of the overall services, right? So for example, we can have a KPI, we can say percentage of revenue from new services. So for example, if this is your overall revenue, right? And you want to see that how much of the revenue, this is your overall revenue. So how much of the revenue is from the new service? This will show you that how good are we performing from innovation perspective, because innovation is for something new. So the percentage revenue in comparison of the overall revenue is from the new service. It could be a very good measure, right? Right. Now, what you have suggested me, right? Again, that's the problem, guys, right? So watch it very carefully, right? What she has suggested just now, right? Madiha has just suggested, consider the new ideas in the pipeline. Yes, this is what we call innovation, right? But if you are going to measure a system, you need to have a KPI for that. So the suggestion will be for the KPI. What need to be measured exactly, right? What need to be measured? Innovation. Okay. Now, the second one, consider APX accountancy. The second dimension is resource utilization. From resource utilization, how are you going to measure the resource utilization which wasn't measured before, right? Resource utilization. So first of all, you have to think that what are their resources mainly, right? Well, maybe their main resources are their staff, right? It's a service provider, isn't it? Right? Accountancy firm. So their staff is their main resources. So are they using their resources in a good way or a bad way? What should be the measure? Can you give me a suggestion? Okay. Now, one of you have suggested me um, the budgeted hours that the staff is supposed to do, and versus the actual hours, for example, the staff has worked, right? Yes, that's also a good one. It's acceptable, right? Or for example, what was the other? The number of hours worked by the staff, right? So of course you want the staff to be working more, right? Yes, this is also a good one, but I actually give you a better one. For example, number of staff per client. So how many staff members do you have for one client? Right? Of course, you'll have less staff members and you'll have more clients, right? Right. So how many staff, number of staff members for one client is available per client, right? And then you can also say this one is even better. For example, percentage of chargeable hours compared to the hours worked. right? You see, when the auditors are going to visit the client, right? So they will be charging for those hours from the client. So how many hours are they charged and how many hours they have actually worked, right? This is very important, right? Like if they are working for 8 hours, for example, are they actually charging the client also for 8 hours, right? It means they are the real productive hours. We are considering the real productive hours, right? Right? Resource utilization, right? Now, I'll actually tell you one thing, guys, right? When you're suggesting something, I'm actually right now, I'm just suggesting the KPIs. But remember, in exam, if you have to suggest the KPIs, make sure you justify it as well. That what will happen if you will consider the percentage of revenue from the new service, it will actually encourage our staff members to get more and more revenue from the new service, right? So you have to justify your measure, your suggestion. Or for example, the percentage of chargeable hours compared to the hours worked by staff, right? So of course, if the chargeable hours are important, if we are actually measuring it, right, then of course, the staff members who are working for the client, they'll try to make those hours more and more productive, right? So you have to justify it, right? Okay, let's talk about the flexibility perspective, which was also ignored above. Flexibility perspective. Are we flexible enough, right? For example, what can be the flexibility that we are providing to our clients, for example, right? Anything? Okay, I would say a good measure would be the percentage of jobs completed on time. So if you're doing something for the client, how many times we have completed the jobs on time? Percentage of jobs completed on time, right? Percentage of the jobs completed on time. Now you see, this was an 8 marker question and I have actually divided that into 2 parts. That's what you'll be doing for your exam as well, right? Okay, now let me see what do we have next. Briefly evaluate the marketing manager's statement about the customer services scoring, right? Remember, the marketing manager was saying that, look, customer services scoring is the most important thing to consider. And then he has said that, look, if the customer scoring for business advisory was bigger, and that's why it has achieved more revenue in comparison of the audit and the tax, right? So how are we going to, what should be our answer for this, right? If you're going to evaluate the marketing manager's statement, right? Do you think he's right or wrong? What do you think? He's right or wrong? Okay, now I'll say part D. For example, let me type this one. So I'll say D, part D, right? We will never say it directly if it is right or wrong. We have to analyze it first. Remember, we have to gain marks in the exam. How many marks are there given to us for this particular question? 5 marks. We cannot simply say wrong or right, right? We need to analyze it, right? So we'll say importance of customer service is significant as it is significant as it is service industry, right? In service industry, of course, it is very significant, right? That should be our first point, that, well, what the marketing manager is saying is not completely wrong, right? But then we are going to say that client may not like audit service because of the nature of the service, right? Nobody likes auditors. Nobody likes auditors, right? It's because of the nature of the service, right? It's not because they are performing good or bad. It's because of the nature of the service, right? And then we can say, therefore, customer services or service scoring can be misleading. It can give you misleading results. It will show, okay, the audit and the tax partners are not actually performing very good, but it was because of the nature of the service, right? They may be performing good, but because because people don't like the auditors, maybe they are not going to give the best scoring, right? Better score of business advisory service, maybe not because of customer service, but it can be because of recession in England, the name of the country, right? So we'll try to use these words so that the marker again gets like impression that, well, we are actually answering the question, right? It can be because of the recession in the country, and that's why they are not getting the best customer services, right? Now, building block model, guys, look at this. It's such a good question. Such a good question. So make sure you practice well. I'll send you the standard answer also. I'll share it with you, right? The examiner's answer, and make sure you read it well. Make sure you try it like at least a couple of times, right? It's a very good question, right? Okay. And I believe that will be enough for today, right? I think that will be enough for today. Okay. Do you guys have any question?